You know that your lesson should be student-centered, and you know that it's important to choose just one main focus or aim for each lesson. In my last video, I told you to think of your lesson like a taxi ride or an Uber or Lyft ride to the airport. Your students are the passengers, and the main aim of the lesson, what you're trying to achieve, is ultimately the destination. As the driver, it's your job to get the students from point A to point B, or in other words, from the beginning of the lesson to the destination, to the achievement of the main aim, as efficiently and effectively as possible. So how do you do it? Once you've set a main aim for your lesson, how do you make sure you achieve it? That's what I'm going to teach you in this video. If you're just joining for the first time, welcome. I'm Shannon. If you are a teacher of adult English language learners, then I'm so happy that you're here to improve your English language teaching. If you're just starting out with this video, this is actually part of a short series about the fundamentals of effective English teaching. It's really tempting to overcomplicate what makes a good or not so good English lesson, but as you'll see in this short series of videos, it really just comes down to four main things. I call these things the fundamentals of effective teaching. So in the previous two videos, we covered fundamental number one. It's all about the students, the importance of making sure your lessons are student-centered and interactive. And fundamental number two is that your lesson should have one main focus or aim. So as I said before, if the main aim is the destination of this taxi ride and you're the driver, what is the route that you take to get to that destination? How do you make sure you get there in the best possible way? That's fundamental number three. Fundamental number three is about having a foolproof roadmap that you can use to make sure you always get to your destination on time. In other words, teaching fundamental number three is to use a lesson framework. So what is a lesson framework? A lesson framework is essentially an outline or a structure that you can use to teach a particular type of lesson. It's a sequence of different stages, and each stage in your lesson is going to consist of one specific type of activity. The great thing about lesson frameworks is that you can use the same framework each time you teach that particular type of lesson. A reading lesson has a framework. A grammar lesson has a couple different options of frameworks. A writing lesson can always use the same framework. So these are essentially templates that you can follow that make your planning and your teaching much more streamlined and cohesive. The particular frameworks that I teach are certainly not the only ways to teach. For example, the reading lesson framework that I like to use is not the only possible way to teach a reading lesson. But the important thing about frameworks is that they're a way to teach a lesson that works. It's a roadmap that is guaranteed to get you from point A to point B, or essentially to get you from the beginning of the lesson to making sure you achieve the main aim at the end, so the students walk away with a meaningful, memorable outcome. You want your students to leave each class you teach them feeling better at one particular thing in English. The framework is how you get there. So the first thing you need to understand about lesson frameworks is that the framework you use is determined by the lesson type. So in the previous video about having one clear aim or outcome, we talked about the fact that there are 7 different types of lessons you can teach when teaching English: reading, listening, speaking, writing, vocabulary, grammar, and functional language. So the first thing you'll do is choose one of those 7 to be the main aim or focus of your lesson, and then the framework follows from there. And the reason for this is that the way you approach teaching a reading lesson, which is about comprehension, right? Receptive skills, receiving information and understanding it, is going to be different than the way you approach, say, a writing lesson, which is a productive skill. It's about output, producing language, fluency. And those are going to be different than teaching a grammar lesson, which is a system. So it's about learning this set of rules and then putting that into practice in communication. You're going to approach all of those different types of lessons in slightly different ways. And so the framework is going to vary depending on what exactly you're trying to teach, what exactly your main aim is. So let's take a look at an example and see how a framework really works. Think of a reading lesson. Remember that if you're teaching reading, you're going to focus on one particular text, and the whole lesson is going to be focused around helping the students understand that text that you've chosen. So you have a text. What are all the different things that you might do in that reading lesson to help the students really work with and understand and develop their comprehension around this text? Obviously, you want the students to read it, right? You might have the students read that text in a lot of detail and take as much time as they need and really try to get the intricacies of the meaning from that text. You might also have the students practice first reading it more quickly just to get the main idea. So you might have them just skim the text. At some point in the lesson, you may also have the students scan the text just to pick out really important bits of information like names or dates or places. At some point, you might want the students to talk about the text and have a discussion about what they read and share their opinions or their reactions. Probably early on in the lesson, you'll want to introduce the topic of the text and give the students some time to warm up and think about how it relates to their lives or to them personally and get interested in what they're about to read. You may also be concerned that there's challenging vocabulary in that text, and so you might want to pick out a few of those words and clarify them for the students so that they don't get stuck on those words as they're reading. So these are all things that might happen in that reading lesson, helping the students deal with and respond to that text. What you're going to do in a lesson framework is take all of those things and arrange them into a logical, cohesive order. Each activity that you do in the lesson becomes one stage. And then, as I said, the stages are arranged in a particular order to guide the students through the lesson and ultimately get to that final destination of improving their reading comprehension skills. So in a reading lesson, you might first start with a stage called the lead-in, where the students have a very short, maybe pair discussion related to the topic of the text that they're about to read. You may then have the students just read the text very quickly to get the main idea. From there, you might address the vocabulary, as I mentioned, maybe have the students do a matching exercise with some of the more challenging words from the text, so you can remove those as potential obstacles to comprehension. From there, you may have the students read the text again and answer more detailed, more difficult comprehension questions. And then finally, you might have the students have a discussion or even do a short writing exercise where they respond to the text or react to the text in some way that's personalized. So each of those things are different stages in the reading lesson framework. And the really cool thing about a framework is that you can reuse that same framework, that same pattern, that same template anytime you teach a reading lesson. Obviously, the text will be different, and so therefore, the exact discussions that students do will be different. The questions that they answer about the text will be different. The activities themselves will be swapped out based on the text that you've chosen, but the stages themselves, the types of activities that students are doing, the progression of those activities can be the same. So if it's not obvious already, why is using a framework so helpful and so important? Well, first of all, having a clear lesson framework, using that clear lesson framework helps you understand why you're doing every single activity in the lesson and how it fits into the lesson as a whole, how it contributes to the achievement of the main aim. You don't want to be doing activities just because you need something to fill time or just because it's the next thing on the page of the book. You want to make sure you understand the reason for doing that activity and how it's actually helpful for your students in the overall context of this particular lesson. So with a lesson framework, not only are there different stages throughout the lesson that follow this kind of set pattern, depending on what the lesson type is, right? Reading or grammar or vocabulary or whichever one of those 7 that you've chosen, but each stage also has a particular aim. So the aim of the stage is why you're having students do that activity, how it's helping them. So for example, the aim of the lead-in, that very first stage in the lesson, where the students have a short discussion about the topic of the text they're going to read later, The aim of that stage is to engage the students in the lesson, in the topic of the text, to help them warm up and to activate their current knowledge around that topic, to help them recall any helpful vocabulary that they might already know in English related to that topic, to help them make connections between that topic and their own lives. All of that is going to help prepare them to go forward in the lesson into the text, where making those connections is going to be easier because that's already been sort of activated in their minds at the very beginning. So because each stage has a clear aim like that, you plan the lesson knowing that every single thing in your lesson has a useful purpose for your students. So this means that your lesson is going to feel structured and cohesive instead of like a random collection of activities or an unstructured lecture or chat. What you want to avoid when you teach a lesson is, as we learned with fundamental number 1, you don't want your lesson to be a lecture. The other extreme is that you don't want your lesson to be this sort of unstructured, free chat, right? We don't want the students to feel like, I showed up, I talked about something, and then I left, and that was my English class. Sure, it's better than not talking about anything in English, but if that's all the students have done, right? They showed up, they spoke a little bit, they chatted in this unstructured way, and then they left. Yeah, it might help their fluency a little bit, it might help their confidence a little bit, but how can you really prove that their English is better than it was when they first showed up, if that's all they did? So having a lesson framework gives you this helpful structure where you know that what you're doing in the lesson is meaningful. It's actually helping the students. So in this way, using a lesson framework also helps you achieve fundamental number 1, in that you can make sure your lesson is more student-centered, because each stage is going to allow for specific input, information that you're giving the students, and output, language and communication that the students are producing. So by having these set stages, these set activities that the students can do throughout the lesson, you're guaranteeing that your level of SDS, students doing stuff, is going to be high, that the students are going to be engaged and interacting throughout your class. A really cool bonus of using a lesson framework is that it takes the guesswork out of your lesson planning. When you're planning a particular lesson, you don't have to sit there and think, what should I do first? And what should I do second? And then what should I do next? And try to find all these different activities to fill up the time. You know exactly what you need to do next because you'll just follow the lesson framework. This is your roadmap. You don't need to make up the directions or wander around and hope you reach your destination. This is the exact route, the exact set of turns and stops that you need to make in order to get to your destination in the best possible way. So this is going to guide you through the lesson, through your planning of the lesson, so you don't have to come up with all of this stuff on your own. And then finally, as I said, the main reason to use a lesson framework is that it ensures that you reach that main aim. You reach your destination efficiently and effectively. So the key here is that it helps you make sure that each stage of your lesson directly contributes to achieving your main aim. The golden rule for teaching fundamental number 3 is to ensure that each stage of your lesson, each activity that you do in your lesson, is essentially a stepping stone on the path to achieving the main aim. So what's important about this is once you get good at this, it really helps you evaluate which activities fit in a particular lesson and which don't. You can have an activity that's a really good activity, a fun, engaging activity. But if you can't see where on this direct path that it falls towards achieving your main aim, then it could be a great activity, but it means it doesn't belong in that particular lesson. When teachers ask me how I manage my time so effectively in my planning and teaching, this is it. Using a lesson framework is my cheat sheet because I don't have to think about, oh, this is a great activity. Let me try to fit this in and let me try to fit this other activity in. I know exactly what I need in that particular lesson to achieve that aim. And if there's an activity that's a great activity, but it doesn't fit on that path, right? It's a stepping stone that's way over here instead of here. I know to cut that activity out and use it in a different lesson where it does fit on the path to achieving that main aim instead. Frameworks are kind of a classic example of needing to slow down to speed up. It takes a little bit of time to wrap your head around them and practice and really get comfortable with them, but it is worth the investment of learning about them. Because once you get really good at these, once they become second nature, your planning is going to be so much faster and your teaching will be so much more effective. When I have teachers observe me and they ask, how did you make everything flow so smoothly? It's not magic. It's not even my teaching skills. It's just using frameworks. That's it. That's the big secret. So if you want to learn more about frameworks, I'm going to drop a link to my free guide to lesson frameworks in the video description. I'll also leave you the link for the videos on Fundamentals 1 and 2 in case you missed those. And don't forget to tune in to the next video, which is Fundamental number 4. It goes hand in hand with what we just talked about with lesson frameworks, and it's going to be the finishing touch that you put on your teaching to really make it truly effective. So if you're ready, go ahead and watch the next video.